Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. So we extend our warm welcome to our all panelists and our audience in this webinar, which is a part of a series organized by our think tank, delving into the issues connecting the paradigm shifts in the global economy with the implication on the developing world. In our previous two webinars available on our YouTube channel, we addressed the issue of the surge in the global food prices and how developing economies can navigate this challenge. In the next webinar, we explore the future of central banks in developing and emerging economies within the context of a world marked by tectonic shifts stemming from geopolitics, technology, and rising social frictions. Today, our focus is to crucial and timely questions intensified and fueled by a combination of cyclical and structural dynamics, which is economic nationalism. We'll examine its emergence as an anchor for global economic policy and what this signifies for developing economies. Personally, what comes to my mind when discussing this issue is the evolving narrative surrounding this trend. We have transitioned from a situation where the mainstream of economists and policymakers universally agreed on the negative implication of such a stance on prosperity, but the narrative, as in many situations, which was crafted by developing economies amid resistance, gradually adheres to these principles of liberalism, if this can be considered as the antithesis of economic nationalism. However, recent shifts indicating new movements linked to geopolitical tensions among global powers, possibly even stemming from the last global financial crisis, when levers of trade, tools, subsidies, reluctance to free flow of people and capital were beginning to be felt and engaged in different economies. More recently, very aggressive industrial policy undertaken, for instance, by the US, such as the era within the euro, like the Net Zero Industrial Act, represents one of the concrete manifestations of this trend towards self-reliance and resilience as a major objective of economic policy. Simultaneously, there are rising restrictions, for instance, on foreign investments in sectors qualified as strategic, exposing foreign direct investments to global constraint. Immigration remains, as always, one of the most sensitive issues among developed countries. And on top of that lies the relationship between national institution and international institution representing the multilateral dimension, such as the WTO, when it's reframed in an economic context, but this can be also related, for instance, to United Nations. Within this context, developing economies are grappling with the determine the path to pursue and to what extent the values that organize economic relations in the past remain valid, and in the future also. They are also contemplating how to compete with the more assertive stances of developing economies in Africa. For instance, the most ambitious project is the effective implementation of the African Free Trade Agreement that entered into force years ago, and that constitutes one of the major stones in the way of endowing Africa, for instance, with the tool to foster its development process. And to discuss and to delve into this issue, allow me to welcome our two panelists, Mr. Dominique Puteaux, who is a principal policy specialist working on country financing through graduation, sovereign EDB access for IDF countries within the African Development Bank, and Mr. Bertram Wolf, Director and CEO of the German Council on Foreign Relations, with also an extensive expertise in European economy, economic statecraft, geoeconomics, climate policy, in Germany's geopolitical strategy. So without any further ado, I'll give the floor to Mr. Dominique Puteaux. I remind all our panelists that they will have 15 minutes each for their presentation, and along the way, I'll be gathering questions from our audience. So Mr. Dominique Puteaux, the floor is yours.
Thank you, merci. Thank you, Mr. Abdelaziz, for the introduction, and good morning, good afternoon, welcome everyone. Nice to meet you, Mr. Wolf, as well. Welcome everyone, wherever you're connecting from. So my name is Dominique Puteaux. I work for the African Development Bank. I'm based in Abidjan. And for this topic, I would like to I will clarify, a few aspects about economic nationalism. I will speak about as well what it actually means, geofragmentation. It's a complicated word with many attributes. I will discuss the implication for developing countries, but with a focus on Africa. I'll discuss some strategies for developing countries, as well with a focus on Africa. And then in my last point, I will discuss how the African Development Bank supports or does not support, or anyway, what the bank does in this context. So first, we have to understand that economic nationalism is not new. It refers to a policy approach that prioritizes domestic economic interest and seeks to protect and promote the national economies through various measures. That can be trade barriers, subsidies, preferential treatment for domestic industries. In recent years, the rise of geofragmentation has added a new dimension to economic nationalism, impacting developing countries in significant ways. So the economic nationalism is rooted in the belief that it is important to protect industries and markets from foreign competition, and that can safeguard national interest and promote economic growth. In history, we have the United States, for example, that implemented economic nationalism to protect its tariffs in the 19th century for its industrial development. In more recent times, we have countries like India that used economic nationalism to protect their domestic subsidies from foreign competition. In not so recent times, Europe, after the Second World War, protected large segments of its economy that would actually run counter to the principles of free trade at this point to develop, for example, its airspace industry with the success that we know with Airbus, for example, and the European space program. And that would not have happened with free competition, especially with the disbalance of power. So let me discuss geofragmentation and its impact. So the geofragmentation is the fragmentation of global economic integration due to geopolitical tensions. This is not new again, trade disputes, and also technological advancements. It's not necessarily policy-based. This phenomenon has led to a reconfiguration of global supply chains and trade patterns. We've also seen that in COVID with trade patterns that may have shifted, and that a few inputs that were difficult to find, especially, for example, in the microchip industry. The area of geofragmentation has brought new challenges for developing countries. As major economies engage in protectionist measures and geopolitical rivalries intensify, developing nations are faced with disruptions in their access to global markets and resources that can hinder their economic development and exacerbate existing inequalities. When we discuss, for example, the tensions between the United States and China, that has led to a shift in the global supply chains that have impacted countries that rely on interconnected networks for their exports and imports. When I discuss, for example, advancements in the technology, we also have technological advancements such as automation and digitalization that have reshaped industries. I think we still have to measure the impact of further digitalization through COVID in terms of how it can further change geofragmentation of the economy. So let me discuss the general principles for the developing countries. On the one hand, protectionist measures in major economies can limit market access for goods from developing nations, potentially leading to reduced export opportunities for economic growth constraints. However, although we do have protectionism, I would say there are a few safeguards. As you know, the EU has a long-standing agreement with the Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific countries, the poorest, for which basically those countries, the poorest countries, can export to the EU free of tariffs, anything but basically arms, weapons. And the US has a similar agreement with the Africa Growing Together, Africa Growth Opportunity Act, for which basically the poorest countries typically can export to the US free of tariffs. That does not mean that it is free of other issues such as quality standards, but that's free of tariffs. So if global supply chains undergo restructuring due to geofragmentation, developing countries may face difficulties in adapting to those changes. Moreover, the rise of economic nationalism in key markets may lead to a reduction in foreign direct investment flowing into developing countries. Let me discuss now the opportunities for domestic industries, of course, for developing countries. Economic nationalism can provide opportunities for developing countries to build their domestic industries and reduce reliance on imports. For example, we've seen that Tanzania has a very national policy towards its resources. Gabon recently, for example, banned export of raw resources. So this is part of some kind of economic nationalism which promotes domestic industry and domestic transformation. India is an outstanding story. The Made in India initiatives boosted manufacturing across various sectors, such as electronics, automobiles, and defense. How they did that, they imposed tariffs on certain imports and provided incentives for local production. The best example through the recent history is the Asian tigers. Again, after the Second World War, basically the South Korea, other Asian tigers, Thailand, for example, and others, adopted a very sound economic path whereby they would foster some segments of the economy. South Korea, Taiwan, for example, would protect some segments of the economy, would invest, for example, in the training of the workforce in order to be the best, and then opened up those segments, and then they went for basically higher added value segments, and that's how Taiwan and South Korea basically developed so much in the last 70 years. And this is basically a good combination of protectionism and the market economy. So of course, I'm talking here about the trade-off with global integration. Economic nationalism can pose a trade-off between protecting domestic industries and participating in global trade. This is why it requires careful planning, which has to be tailored to specific countries. So developing countries need to carefully balance their pursuit of economic nationalism with the benefits of international cooperation and integration. Overly protectionist measures may hinder ability to attract FDI, foreign direct investments, access new technologies, and benefit from economies of scales. So this is maybe, I will discuss the trade-off that East Africa has met in its integration through the East African community. We had economies like Kenya that were dominating and that are still dominating East Africa, and economies lagging behind, for example, in Burundi. And so what you do, well, basically open up a free flow of capital, goods, and people between a giant and the countries that has not yet reached of development. So that basically was quite an issue, and that's still subject to debate. But overall, it's been proven that opening up the economy, especially within its close neighbors, leads to development of everyone if this is carefully mitigated, if basically the negative impact are carefully mitigated. So there is also basically a trade-off for FDIs. Everybody wants to attract FDIs through tax incentives, streamlined regulations, infrastructure development, investment promotion. But of course, protective measures, nationalism may encourage for FDI. And this is a example for restrictive labor policies, where usually FDIs also flow when there is open labor policies. In the case of Equatorial Guinea, for example, it's very difficult to both attract FDI and also employ internationals, basically staff from for which FDI is linked. So this is basically a policy mix that Equatorial Guinea and other countries, for example, in Central Africa and Gabon, are trying to have, whereby they will allow international labor to flow in, but they will also encourage hiring local staff. And so this is a careful policy balance that has to be taken into account. Let me discuss rapidly the strategies for developing countries. I think it's important, number one, to diversify markets. Developing countries should prioritize diversifying their export markets to reduce dependence on a single market of group of countries. This is a way to mitigate the risk associated with geofragmentation and ensure a more resilient export sector. Vietnam has recently, over a short history, has successfully diversified its export markets by expanding its trade relationships with countries in Asia, Europe, and Americas, and Vietnam is quite an export giant for now. I think number two, it's important basically to benefit from both aspects to invest in infrastructure and innovation. Enhancing domestic infrastructure and investing in innovation can boost the competitiveness of developing countries and basically mitigate the cost of over economic nationalism. We all know that Rwanda has heavily invested in infrastructure, including the ongoing construction of the Bugesera new airport, international airport, modernize the transportation systems, improve the energy infrastructure, and this is very beneficial to attract FDIs in the context of global competition. So in terms of regional integration, the benefits are the enhanced bargaining power. Through regional integration, developing countries can strengthen their bargaining power in global trade negotiations. This is why there's so many economic blocks in Africa, and this is why there is an effort to make only one. A larger consumer market, stronger economic cooperation, and shared prosperity. This is something that the African Continental Free Trade Area, something that the African Development Bank is supporting, is trying to aim at. Now, let me finally discuss, I think I still have some time, what the African does in this context. Obviously, the AFDB is a global institution that promotes liberalism and that will not promote economic nationalism, but we are aware that countries have to find their own path, and it's an important policy mix that I mentioned. So I'll just discuss first the AFDB's role in promoting economic integration. The bank promotes economic integration within Africa through various initiatives and projects. It fosters regional trade agreements, infrastructure development, investment in key sectors, such as agriculture and energy. We also support, even financially, catalytic regional projects. And we support through policy advice and investments, reduction in barriers to trade, and we enhance economic cooperation among African nations. We support, number two, inclusive economic growth, because we believe that inclusive growth will benefit from all segments of society and ultimately benefit either economic nationalism or mitigating the impact of basically economic fragmentation. So basically, the bank prioritizes projects that create employment opportunities, improve access to education and healthcare, empower marginalized communities. And we encourage basically equitable distribution of economic benefits. And so in doing so, we mitigate the potential negative impacts of protectionist policies that may exacerbate social inequalities. Another point is that sustainable development is a key investment factor. The bank promotes long-term economic stability while addressing global challenges, such as climate change, so investments in renewable energy, climate-resilient infrastructure, and environmentally sustainable practices. It is key that whatever the path the country follows, either economic nationalism or ways to mitigate geofragmentation, I think that the shared goods, such as the global challenges we have, such as climate change, has to be taken into account. I mentioned that the bank promotes multilateral cooperation as well. And maybe the last point is that to promote economic nationalism and further shared economic development, the bank promotes technology transfer and capacity building through the development, for example, of entrepreneurship, and also capacity in key industries such as manufacturing, agriculture, which can actually help reduce dependence on foreign powers and promote self-sufficiency. So I'm pretty much done for these talks for now. Again, there is a fine line between economic nationalism that is sound for economic development and economic nationalism that basically is a lose-lose for all parties. I think that every country finds its path towards mitigating the impact of geofragmentation. Geofragmentation is a risk, but also a benefit to reshape the economy. I think this is geofragmentation is typically a Schumpeter aspect of destruction and creation. So thank you very much for your time. I don't know how I'm doing for time, but I think I will pass on the floor to the next speaker. Thank you very much.
No, you're great. You're great. So thank you for your insightful presentation. And for this, I think I keep in mind this idea of how challenging is it to strike this balance between fostering the local fabric and finding a way to integrate in the global economy in serving the greater good. So we'll move to Mr. Gontram Wolf, who will share with us his perspective, maybe from a northern perspective and European perspective. It might be different on this issue. So, Mr. Wolf, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me and hosting me. So my name is Guntram Wolf, and I'm a PhD economist and the director of the German Council on Foreign Relations. And I'm also working as a professor at the Willy Brandt School of Public Policy, where I teach public policy and climate economics and geoeconomics. Look, what I thought I would do is today start off from where we came from, which is what I would say a multilateral order, rules-based world, then discuss the challenges that this world increasingly is facing, and then zoom in on China and the US in particular, and then on the responses that the European Union is undertaking and the difficulties it has with the responses to these developments. So let's start off from the order. So we used to run the world economy in a relatively ordered way, meaning global trade was regulated by the WTO, the National Monetary System, supported by the International Monetary Fund. And there were, by and large, relatively widely agreed rules, in particular when it comes to trade and investment. Now, this order has been under very severe pressure, and it has been under severe pressure because of, I would say, three main developments. The first is that increasingly big powers have been using economic relations as a way to play a power game and weaponize these economic relations to gain political advantages. Now, a recent example of that is the weaponization of gas deliveries from Russia to the European Union. The European Union was highly dependent, and my country, Germany, was highly dependent on Russian gas. And Vladimir Putin did threaten to stop the gas flows and eventually stop them, with very significant effects on the price of gas, the price of energy in Europe, but then, of course, also with significant effects on the external balance of Germany and the European Union. Now, he tried to do that thinking that this would actually shift the behavior of policymakers in their support of Ukraine. And the reality is that he had some success in the sense that he could not only make a lot of money on the gas that he sold at very high prices, but also that arguably the support for Ukraine was weaker at the beginning than it would have been without that threat from Russia. So in other words, weaponization of interdependence is a way to really undermine the global order. And when countries are very much dependent on one source of energy, and just to give you the number, in the case of Germany, it was more than 55% of its gas coming from Russia, then of course it has significant political effects. And economies and countries now around the world are scrambling to deal and reduce the risk of weaponization of interrelations with negative economic consequences for our well-being. Now, the second reason I would say the national has been under threat is related to, I would say, what I would call domestic economic nationalism, right? And that's more the topic we are discussing today. I mean, what it is basically an attempt to build an industry and massively increase an industry at the expense of the industry developments in other jurisdictions. Now, a prominent example of that phenomenon is, for example, the massive industrialization efforts that China is undertaking. China has been using huge amounts of domestic resources, financial repression on its own consumers in order to channel resources and channel funding towards its manufacturing sector and use that manufacturing sector to grow. After the global financial crisis, China shifted very substantially to the construction sector, hoping that construction would be the growth engine, and it was for about 10 years. But of course, the property boom has now come to an end, and China now does have to think about what can it do to boost its growth. And unfortunately, instead of boosting domestic consumption, it is putting a lot of resources into the manufacturing sector, more than the domestic economy can absorb. The result is very clear. The Chinese external trade surplus is increasing relative to the European Union. It has doubled within a few years, and the deficit of the EU now is about 400. Wait, I just had the number here. Sorry, I wanted to check that number and give you the precise number. Yeah, about 400 billion. Yeah, the EU trade deficit with China is now about 400 billion, and it's really the trade balance in goods. Yeah, so it really puts direct pressure on domestic production, and is therefore a major distortion to the economy because it's not a result of market forces. It is a result of strong subsidization combined with financial engineering and financial repression channeled towards the domestic production sector in China. Now, the third area where significant threats are emerging is in the area, indeed, of the green economy, and I would say in particular, the question of critical raw materials needed for the green economy. And there it is actually also interesting how the interplay between China, the US, and the European Union and other major economies is playing out. Let me start with the US, with China. So China has been very systematically building a massive advantage in green supply chains, and in particular in the processing of critical raw materials, in raw materials that are needed for the transition, but also those that are needed for the digital transition. China holds market shares of 80, 90 or more percent of the globe, global market shares. So these are highly concentrated markets with a strong dominance of China. That dominance isn't an accident. It's been a very deliberate policy choice of the Chinese government, which invested into mining in many countries around the world, But again, it's not just the mining, it's what is even more concentrated is actually the processing of these raw materials. The processing often happens in China itself. So this is a massive challenge to the development of a global green economy, because it becomes so increasingly concentrated in one country. In response to that, the United States under President Biden undertook a policy that actually is in many respects quite similar to that of the Chinese. It is the government has decided to not only subsidize the green economy enormously, but also to protect domestic production relative to foreign production. So it is again a major program that doesn't exercise economic nationalism. Yet, if two major economies in the world play an uncooperative game, then it can be optimal under certain conditions to also play an uncooperative game. And that is the big debate. Should the European Union do this, and how far should it go? And the European Union has undertaken some steps in playing an uncooperative game, including with its own Critical Raw Materials Act and Net Zero Industry Act. So these are measures to boost domestic production and and also ensure critical raw materials in the green space. But let's say the response has been overall relatively muted, and especially muted compared to the US. And I think there are basically three reasons why Europe and the European Union has been somewhat muted. I mean, the first is that playing an uncooperative game is very costly. Yeah, so the tax bill of the Inflation Reduction Act in the US is on the spending side $600-700 billion, on the revenue side easily another $1 trillion US dollars. In China, the numbers are quite comparable. Now, is that a fiscal cost that the European Union wants to do at the moment? The answer is no. So the EU has done some of it, but certainly not to the same extent. The second argument why the EU has been reluctant to do this is that it genuinely believes that protectionism ultimately may backfire, even for your own innovativeness of your own economy. So the more you protect industries, the longer you protect them, the less they feel the pressure to really be innovative. And there's quite a bit of research on that. So the jury is out on whether the US strategy in the end will be a winning strategy. The third reason why I think the EU has been quite restrained in its response is indeed that it still does believe in the multilateral order, and it knows that many countries in the world want to see and want to work with the European Union to be a cooperative player. So this is, I think, where the EU currently stands. So instead of sort of a very broad approach to responding to uncooperative players from China and the US, the discussion is now focusing increasingly on, I would say, use the term economic security. So increasingly focusing on areas where there may be really direct vulnerabilities to external players. The US-American security advisor, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, has coined the phrase small yard, high fence. So meaning there's a small area of goods where you need to exercise protectionism because they are essentially directly security relevant. Yeah, that may be top-end chips that have dual military use. But basically it's in these areas where you exercise significant security measures to avoid an abuse. But otherwise, you try to remain relatively open. And I think that's what the European Union is basically also doing. It complements that strategy with a diversification strategy, so reducing dependence from Chinese dominance in green supply chains is not just done by supporting domestic mining, but also actively searching and looking for new partnerships. And the EU is at the moment in discussions with Latin America, with Mercosur, to have a major trade deal with the aim to diversify further. I really hope they will manage to conclude that deal. I'm not so optimistic, unfortunately, because there's different views within the EU on this, but my sense is that instead of closing, you really need to open up to as many players as possible, diversify, and thereby increase the resilience of your economy. So let me stop here. Sorry, I talked way too long.
So thank you so much, Mr. Wolf. Thank you so much, Mr. Dominic. So one of the audience is actually asking on this point of equilibrium that we should seek between economic security and at the same time fostering the values of globalization at the international level. For example, Mr. Wolf, I just said that in the case of the United States, which aims for fostering its national security, for example, the chips industry or the green industry. At the same time, it is quite difficult, for example, for the US or for Euro to move forward in terms of greening its economy without relying on China, maybe in the short or in the medium term, where China has clearly a comparative advantage compared to other countries. So the question is on this point of equilibrium between fulfilling the national security, which is can be an understandable objective, and at the same time leveraging on international cooperation to move forward in different and achieving different objectives, such as fighting climate change. Mr. Wolf and Mr. Dominic, feel free to share your points.
Well, I mean, I think I tried to answer, but let me just say very quickly. I mean, I think the idea that you can recreate entire value chains domestically is quite illusionary, right? I mean, even for a relatively big economy like the European Union, we will remain and we should remain highly dependent on global integration also in the green supply chain. Having said that, China at the moment just dominates the green supply chain so much that for the next 10 years, there will be no green transition without China. I mean, that's just the simple reality. It will take 10 years to gradually reduce that dependence, that excessive dependence. But the dependence is now so big that basically it is important to start diversification. But I mean, it's also important to accept that globally, the green transition at the moment will largely hinge on China's willingness and ability to export large amounts of solar panels and batteries and many other issues.
Maybe if I can step in on this after Mr. Wolf, and more specifically in relation to developing countries and maybe in Africa, I think it's impossible to start a segment of the economy or to start competitiveness from scratch if you are already involved into a larger global competition with strong players that have had time to build foundations for specific economic sectors, which is why countries have to plan their the equation between protecting specific sectors of the economy and training their workforce. And I think the example of South Korea and Taiwan after the Second World War is very important. They identified specific economic sectors for which they will deliver, they will be the best. And actually they increased the added value of the sectors every decade or so and tailored specific training to their workforce. And in the case of Africa, basically, this definitely added values in the area of, for example, transformation of raw resources. And I think that countries like Tanzania, for example, or Gabon are planning their economic development accordingly. But it is a mix of protecting some segments of the economy and also embracing a further integration in the world. So this is a different response to Mr. Wolf, as it's more tailored to economic policy development, economic policy in developing countries. I hope this complements.
Yes, thank you. A second question, and this would be our last one. One of our audience is asking, actually, in the light of recent calls for developing countries for a reevaluation of the roles and structure of MDPs during the annual meetings held here in Africa, how do you think these institutions can adapt to better serve the evolving needs of developing nations in the era of economic nationalism and geofragmentation?
I get the question is institutions meaning multilateral development banks, right? I will take this hypothesis. I think that MDBs have a very crucial role to play to make sure that common threats are addressed at the common level. The World Bank and the African Development Bank, Asian Bank, major MDBs, Inter-American Development Bank as well, acknowledge that our mandate should go way beyond poverty alleviation and economic development. We have to be facilitators with regards to global public goods and global public threats, and one of which is basically climate change and global warming. And this is something that has to be tackled in an international level, and MDBs have a role to play. The same way that we want to get involved with migration, because this drastically impacts both economic development, social well-being, poverty alleviation. So there's like global public goods, and I think this is the key themes in the strategies of MDBs now and in their future visions. Global public goods have had to be addressed by international organizations, and basically global public goods have their importance beyond economic development and the traditional poverty alleviation mandate that we have.
Mr. Gunther, any comments?
No, I mean, I agree that multilateral development banks play a very important role, and I also agree that the focus on global public goods is very important. And I think the climate issue is certainly a key issue. When it comes to climate, I mean, the big challenge will be the cost of capital, right? I mean, the rolling out green technology is very capital intensive, and in large parts of the developing world, capital costs are really a very strong and binding constraint. And so finding good ways of leveraging public funding to reduce interest rates and perhaps even the exchange rate risks is, to my mind, a good approach to reduce the sort of obstacles to a rollout of green technology around the world.
For the case of, for example, of the IMF, those geofragmentation issue, this clash between China and the US is being brought to these institutions. In the case of the re-evaluation of the quotas that really represents the weights of these economies. And these institutions, you said it, that preserve one of also of the public international goods, which is financial stability. So it's quite difficult to put this kind of institutions aside from this kind of issues between the global powers. So how do you think the IMF, if you take it as an example, could be restrained from getting involved in this kind of issue?
Well, okay, I can just say one word on this. I mean, I don't think it can, right? I mean, the IMF is a multilateral Bretton Woods institution, but it's an institution which has shareholders, right? And it's clear who are the main shareholders of the IMF. It's not China, right? I mean, it's the United States, it's the European Union. And so obviously, this is what the whole discussion about the reform of the Bretton Woods institutions was all about. I mean, would we accept a shift in the voting rights at these two institutions, the IMF and the World Bank? And the answer that US Congress gave was very clear: no, we don't, right? I mean, so we want to be at the helm of these institutions. And so these institutions therefore remain, in a sense, globally oriented, but still quite Western-led institutions. And I think that China has, of course, therefore built also its own bank, the AIIB, in a sense to have a bank which in which the West is involved as well. As you know, many European countries are in the AIIB as shareholders, but China is the dominant player. And so I think that's the way the global financial architecture has evolved, and will probably evolve further into.
So thank you so much, Mr. Gontran-Wolf. Thank you so much, Mr. Dominique Puteaux, for your insightful presentation. Thanks to our audience. So this is the end of our webinar, and thank you. Au revoir. Bye.
Thank you. C'était un plaisir.
Plaisir partagé. Merci beaucoup, monsieur Dominique.
Ok, je vous en prie, merci. Désolé, je suis dans une chambre d'hôtel, donc la lumière n'est pas superbe. Et, bon,
non,
voilà.
C'était parfait. Merci beaucoup.
Ok, merci beaucoup. Bonne journée.